Hi everybody and welcome back to the Luco Show. Today's video is a bit of a follow-up on the video I released last Sunday, and today we're just going to look at the different specific reasons why I believe that we're going to experience a Great Depression beginning in the next year or two. And I want to explain why I believe that this crash that we've experienced in the last few weeks is not the catalyst for the Great Depression. In my opinion, I don't believe it will be. I think that there will be another euphoric wave still to come before we enter a period of depression. And I think it's important to look at that point, even if you disagree with me. The vast majority of economists, particularly all those who have an increasing popularity in recent times on YouTube, all believe that this is the start of it. So it's good to hear a slightly different view, if nothing else. So if you look at Jim Rickards and Peter Schiff, George Gammon, Mike Maloney and all at Gold Silver, Lynette Zhang and all at ITM Trading, and a lot of different channels. More recently you've got people like Ben Felix coming on the scene who's alluded to the same. Real Vision, Ray Dalio even has insinuated that he thinks this might be the start of the Depression. And a lot of people are moving themselves, positioning themselves for it now, and they're moving towards gold and silver and precious metals and things like this at the moment. I fundamentally disagree. I think that they're all brilliant economists, and they understand history of economics very well, and they understand that in time there will come a time for precious metals, and really their prices should go through the roof. I think there will be short term, as in the next 12 to 18 months, a dramatic collapse in the price of gold and silver, and I'll allude to that and get onto the reasons for that a little later. What we're just going to briefly cover, we're going to look firstly at the gold standard. I think it's incredibly important for people to have a good idea of how we came to our current system of fiat currency. Next year will be 2021. It'll be exactly 50 years from Richard Nixon took the US dollar off the gold standard in August of 1971. So we're going to look at what preceded that in the 20th century and how basically for the first time in modern history we've got to this situation where currency is not convertible to gold or to any other fixed store of value. Rather, it is simply backed by the goodwill of respective governments and central banks, and it's effectively just a piece of paper that we have confidence in, and once the confidence in that piece of paper goes, it erodes. And like any other time fiat currency throughout history has been the chosen method of currency, it always comes to a bad ending. So we'll look briefly at the gold standard. We're going to look at interest rates. I'm specifically going to look at the Bank of England base rate. You can see, you can load up an Excel file in a few minutes on a Google search, and you can see any changes made to the base rate, the minimum lending rate of the Bank of England since 1694, so for 320 years. And I want to specifically look at where we are now and where we have been for the last 10 years, because it's crucially important to understand the situation that people are being put in, because effectively interest rates are at an all-time low and have been for about 10 years, and inflation and the cost of living, the cost of goods and services, is high and increasing every year as a result of money printing, quantitative easing going through the roof. So that puts people in a position whereby they're actively losing money, while actively losing wealth while their money sits in the bank. So it forces them into more risky types of behaviour, like investing in stock markets or investing in houses and real estate and things like this. We're also then going to look at real estate, how the whole interest rate phenomenon of it being so low effectively forces, like aggressively encourages, if not forces, people into trying to get on the property ladder with massive mortgages tied around their neck effectively, and how that's effectively stimulating artificial demand, as credit is so easily accessible, and there are also help to buy schemes and co-ownership schemes given by different governments, government organisations. And then we're just going to briefly touch on gold and silver prices and also allude to the pension crisis as well. So yeah, A depression is 90 years in the making. Roughly every 90 years we have seen one of these over the last couple of centuries. A depression is not caused by some pandemic that shuts down the economy, although aggressively, for a period of a few months. It's not caused in itself by a housing market bubble. It's not caused by even a student loans crisis or a pensions crisis or the dot-com bubble before it, nor is it created by any of the other recessions going back as far as the lows of the last depression in 1932. Rather, a depression is caused by all of these instances, all of these factors, and importantly, it's caused by governmental responses to these times of difficulty, to the responses by central banks coinciding with the response of governments, and ultimately the cumulative impact of all of these different things over a 90-year spell leads to a depression. So yeah, really quickly, I'm just going to read through one little passage on the history of the gold standard. This is a good passage. These are notes that I've compiled over the last few years, and I'm just going to very, very briefly read this out. From 1871 to 1914, coincidentally 1914 was whenever the Federal Reserve was created in the US, and it was also obviously the start of World War One. From 1871 to 1914, the gold standard was at its pinnacle. During this period, near ideal political conditions existed in the world. Governments worked very well together to make the system work, but this changed forever with the outbreak of the Great War, World War One, in 1914. With World War One, political alliances changed, international indebtedness increased, and government finances deteriorated. While the gold standard was not suspended, it was in limbo during the war, demonstrating its inability to hold through both good times and bad times. This created a lack of confidence in the gold standard that only exacerbated economic difficulties. It became increasingly apparent that the world needed something that was more flexible on which to base its global economy. At the same time, a desire to return to the idyllic years of the gold standard remained strong among nations. As the gold supply continued to fall behind the growth of the global economy, the British pound sterling and the US dollar became the global reserve currencies. So there were two global reserve currencies at that time, whereas now it's only really the US dollar. Smaller countries began holding more of these two currencies instead of gold. The result was an extenuated consolidation of gold into the hands of a few large nations. The stock market crash of 1929 was one of the world's post-war difficulties. The pound and the French franc were horribly misaligned with other currencies. War debts and repatriations were stifling Germany, which ultimately led to World War II. Commodity prices were collapsing and banks were overextended. Many countries try to protect their gold stocks by raising interest rates to entice investors to keep their deposits intact rather than convert them into gold. The higher interest rates only made things worse for the global economy. In 1931, so 2 years after the start of the Great Depression, at that stage, 2 years into it, it would have only looked like a recession. In 1931, the gold standard in England was suspended, leaving only the US and franc with large gold currencies. Then in 1934, the US government revalued gold from $20 an ounce to $35 an ounce. So Franklin D. Roosevelt, there was an Emergency Banking Act signed in 1933 where FDR made all US citizens that were holding gold give in their gold to the US Treasury at a price of $20 per ounce. So for every, say I had gold in 1933, I was legally obliged to give all of my gold to the US Treasury, and if I was a US citizen, and they would give me back $20 for every 1 ounce of gold that I gave them. 1 year later, less than 1 year later, there was another piece of legislation that FDR put forward that was passed where gold was revalued then from $20.67 per ounce to $35 per ounce. So if I was one of those people who gave in my gold and only got $20 for 1 ounce, and then suddenly that same 1 ounce was worth $35, that effectively diluted my wealth, reduced the wealth of the people who gave in their gold by almost 50%. So it effectively made the US wealthier, but that obviously had a negative knock-on impact to the value of the US dollar in relation to all other currencies all over the world. So then in 1934, the US government revalued gold from $20 an ounce to $35 an ounce, raising the amount of paper money it took to buy 1 ounce to help improve the US economy. As other nations could convert their existing gold holdings into more US dollars, a dramatic devaluation of the dollar instantly took place. This higher price for gold increased the conversion of gold into US dollars, effectively allowing the US to corner the gold market. Gold production soared so that by 1939, start the Second World War, there was enough gold in the world to replace all global currency in circulation. Now, this is important because it leads us to where we are now. As World War II was coming to an end, the leading Western powers met to develop the Bretton Woods Agreement. Now, the Bretton Woods Agreement was an agreement in 1945, end of World War II, which would be the framework for the global currency markets until 1971. So from 45 to 71, we were under the Bretton Woods system, whereby all national currencies were valued in relation to the US dollar, which became the dominant reserve currency. The dollar in turn was convertible to gold at the fixed rate of $35 per ounce. So the global financial system continued to operate upon a gold standard, albeit in a more indirect manner. So from 1945 to 1971, the US dollar was in the gold standard. Every other currency in the world was pegged to the US dollar. So directly the US dollar was in a gold standard. Indirectly, every other currency in the world was pegged to gold, but only via the US dollar, if that makes sense. In 1968, this is the last paragraph I'll read, in 1968 to 1971, both Belgium and the Netherlands cashed in dollars for gold, with Germany and France expressing similar intentions. In August of 1971, Britain requested to be paid in gold, which forced Nixon's hand and officially ended it with him closing the gold window. By 1976, it was official. The dollar would no longer be defined by gold, thus marking the end of any semblance of a gold standard. So in August 1971, Nixon severed the direct convertibility of US dollars into gold. With this decision, the international currency market, which had become increasingly reliant on the dollar since the enactment of the Bretton Woods Agreement in 1945, lost its formal connection to gold. The US dollar, and by extension the global financial system it effectively sustained, entered the era of fiat money. So from 1971 until now, it's 2020, 49 years, call it 50 years, we have been living in a system of fiat currency, whereby no longer can you go into a bank with your pounds or with your dollars and ask for gold to the value of your dollars. Now, dollars and sterling and any other fiat currency in the world are effectively backed by something, the quote is something like, backed by the faith and goodwill of the American government, of the US government. So in effect, it is only confidence, like people's confidence, that backs the value of that little piece of paper that you call a dollar. There is actually nothing technically behind that supporting it. So that is why the Federal Reserve in the US and central banks all around the world have had this capacity over recent generations to print money. Because prior to 71, you couldn't just print money. Because it was on a gold standard, you had to have a certain amount of gold to back up each US dollar. So that restricted central banks' capacity to just make money. But now, since 71, we've been in this situation where any time that there's any sort of need for stimulation of the economy, central banks are able to print money through quantitative easing. That's effectively a term for money printing, and they have a complicated name for it to make it sound complex, so that the average Joe just goes, no thanks, don't want to know, sounds complicated, thanks. But that's the reality. So that's how we got to the system which we're in now. Now, I want to just quickly look at interest rates, and I'm specifically looking here at the Bank of England base rate, the minimum lending rate since 1697. You can see it. Now, this document I'm looking at, you can just quickly get up online. It shows you any changes that there have been to the Bank of England base rate since 1694. Now, the fascinating thing here, say fascinating, it's more terrifying, and it shows you just how insidious this system is and how difficult it is for the average person to navigate through these waters at the moment. For the last 320 years, the average base rate, the average interest rate of the Bank of England has been 6%. It's been just under, it's been 5.97% or something like that, so called 6%. The lowest interest rate, the lowest base rate that the Bank of England has had in the last 320 years has been 2%, which was in 1951. Except for in 2009, it went as low as 1%. In 2018, it went as low as 0.5%. 2017 and 2016. 2017 it was also 0.5%. In 2016 it temporarily got as low as 0.25%. And as of March, as of last month, 2020, it's as low as 0.1%. Now that's fascinating, because for the first time in history, we've had a period, a prolonged period of like 10 years now, where you have an interest rate less than 1.5%. For the most part, for the majority of the last 10 years, less than 1%. Meaning that if you've money sitting in the bank, you're earning less than 1% on that money. And everyone knows that, well, people don't know exactly what the rate of inflation is, but everyone knows that the cost of goods and services goes up each year by more than less than 1% anyway. So inflation at the moment is in and around probably 3, 4, 5%, something like that. So the cost of your goods and services is going up by, say, 4% each year, while the money that you have sitting in the bank is increasing by less than 1% each year. Now that's a tough one to take temporarily, but over 10 years that becomes unsustainable. So you cannot, like, if you're just sitting with money in the bank, if you're in a good enough position to have any money sitting in the bank, you can't just leave it there, because you're actively losing what wealth you have just by having it in the bank. Whereas at all other times in history, you would have been encouraged to be nice little conservative savers, and you're doing well if you're just saving money. That's smart. If you're doing that now, and you have been doing that for the last 10 years, you are losing wealth hand over fist every year. So what does that do to the average man, to the average woman? That encourages you to put your money into more risky assets, but assets that, if you're still being conservative, that most people would say, oh, that's a good investment, that's something that's smart, you should be doing that. Namely, putting money in the stock market. A load of people I've heard saying these days, what do you think, Luke, of if I put my money into exchange traded funds, into the index, sure, things always go up by 4% every year, it'll definitely work out better for me in 10, 15 years. And in the back of my mind, I'm thinking, well, if we have a 90% depression, which I believe we're going to have over the next few years, then no, I don't think you'll get a good return on that. It's hard to explain that to people without going into severe depth to the conversation, obviously, and a lot of people just don't want to have that conversation. But yeah, so people either put it in stocks, or at least if they're in a position to put down a deposit, most people put it into housing. And I believe, and I'll lead on to this next point, I believe that we're going to see the biggest housing market crash that there's ever been. So since 1971, if you look at any asset, if you look at the average house price since 1971, everything has just gone up, and exponentially so in recent years. There have been corrections, namely the 2008 crash along the way, but on a more macro, larger scale, that was just a correction in an otherwise upward moving bull market, and I believe we're very close to approaching the top there. Now, if I use my own city, Belfast, here in Northern Ireland, north of Ireland, I don't care, whatever you want to call it, as an example, the population of Northern Ireland has not increased in the last 10 years. The population of Belfast has not increased in the last 10 years. Yet, the amount of new build housing estates that are cropping up everywhere, and the cost of these houses are increasing all the time. So and I'm going to use an example that Peter Schiff once talked about here. He talked about a scenario where there was a rural pub landlord who maybe every night had 5 different local people would come in to have a few beers. And he didn't notice, he noticed that one summer, business got really, really big. And he was so busy pouring pints, and he was so excited because normally there were 5 people there, now there's 50 people there every single night. He didn't think to notice that all of these new clientele were clowns. What had happened was the circus had come to town. All these clowns were sad, sorry individuals who loved to drink, and they basically came in every night. So the demand for his services was through the roof compared to what it had been. So what did he do? Instead of just sitting and taking their custom as he was, he noticed that, do you know what, I have so much demand at the moment that what I'm going to do is I'm going to go down to the bank, I'm going to get a loan, I'm going to do an extension on my little local bar, and I'm going to actually hire another couple of employees so that I can meet this new demand and make sure that I don't have people queuing up for too long. So business was booming, business was really, really good for 6 weeks. What happened after 6 weeks? The circus rolled out and left town. And suddenly he was in a situation where he only had his 5 regular geezers coming in and drinking every night, but he also had to pay for the 2 new employees that he took on, and he had all this debt where he had extended the premises, and he had this massive oversupply of capacity, but the demand was no longer there. The artificially created demand was no longer there, and there was a mismatch between his oversupply and the non-existent demand. In the same way when it comes to housing and many different things at the moment, if I look at my own city, I see new build estates popping up everywhere. Now, how does this work? Well, there's a massive oversupply at the moment because it has been propped up by an artificial demand. Where does this artificial demand come from? Well, we have record levels of low interest rates. The Bank of England base rate for the last 320 years has never seen interest rates as low as they are today. What does that mean? That means I can go and get a mortgage and pay record low levels of mortgage repayments. Also, to add to that, banks over the last few years have been more willing than ever before throughout history to give out mortgage loans, to give loans additionally for cars, for anything, you name it, and it's also at the lowest payback rates ever. So that encourages people to get more ambitious with their mortgage arrangements, and they always have it in the back of their mind that, oh, it's okay, house prices always increase in value over time because that's the rule. Even though no other market in the history of finance has ever worked like that, nor ever will. People will realise this when the credit scenario has to unwind, and it will. So you have an artificial demand because interest rates are at record lows. Banks are increasingly, and have been over the last couple of generations, increasingly willing to lend ridiculous amounts, like 90% plus mortgages at these really low interest rates. In addition to that, you also have the government giving you schemes, help to buy schemes, co-ownership schemes, any sort of scheme so as to get you on that mortgage ladder. And as a result, the property developers are more than happy to go out and buy land, create new houses, and all over Belfast, my city as an example, there are new build estates, people are moving into them, all the existing houses that were already here, you know, they're still here, but it's like, oh no, I want to get a nice new build with my, you know, friends living next door and all this. It's great, things are going to go on, I can pay that mortgage, it's a nice low mortgage, you know, I get a certain amount of income, I'll always be able to pay off the mortgage. This is an unsustainable phenomenon. The other thing is, employment rates have been at all-time highs for the last couple of years, basically across all the Western world. And if you think about it, if you're employed, you can go into a bank and say, look, I'm employed, here's my payments coming in, can I get a loan? And they just go, yep, no bother, fire on, crack on, son. So you can see how this is kind of brewing up as a perfect storm. And the sad thing is, people look at houses like they're assets, but the reality is that they're liabilities. If you own the house mainly through mortgage, because that's debt, that's a liability. If you've bought cash, if you've bought a house outright, fair enough, you can call that an asset, but the practical realities are that if it's mainly bought by a mortgage and by debt, that's a liability. Because if you buy a £200,000 house and you put down a £20,000 deposit and you borrowed £180,000 from the bank, and the value of that house in a crash and crisis falls to £100,000, you still owe 180 grand to the bank, and the house value is only 100 grand. And in my estimation, I see that this has been like a 10 to 15 year depression. I think by the end of it, houses will have fallen in the region of like between 80 and 90%. Assuming that we're on some sort of similar financial system with the same sort of currency that we'll have now. But hey, that's just me. So yeah, these are all things that I would strongly encourage you to think about. So, some people aren't fans. I personally think Milton Friedman and Rose Friedman, the two of them wrote everything that they wrote together. It was only ever Milton who did the interviews really and gave the lectures, but the two of them met in university and basically wrote everything that that Milton ever wrote. The two of them actually wrote them together. So interesting stat or fact for you. But I personally think he was an absolute genius, and I've watched pretty much every video you can see of him on YouTube, and I need to start reading some of his books. I've read some of his content, but I need to get on to some more of it. But he basically was a big believer in monetary theory. He was a monetarist, and I've just been trying to think about the recent monetary measures that governments and central banks have been implementing because of the crash that we've had the last few weeks, and how this is going to impact us over the next few years. Now, as alluded to earlier on, most economists at the moment think that this is the start of a Great Depression right now. I don't think it is. Now, there have been drastic measures in terms of, we'll not go into the specifics, but in layman's terms, there have been drastic measures in terms of money being printed and interest rates being dropped. And assuming that that does stick and take effect, and I believe it will, I think that that'll lead us to one more euphoric wave. So people will be in a position again to basically borrow more at an even more reduced interest rate. I think that post-lockdown, initially people might be a little bit cautious with their spending as there is so much uncertainty, but I believe that the stock market, as it begins to rally, by the way, we're already technically over 20% off the lows that we saw a few weeks ago, which technically puts us back into another bull market. No one's talking about that, but by the definitions, that is technically where we are. We're technically back into another bull market already. But as things start to ramp up, there's also going to be an increased disconnect. Friedman used to talk about how if you go back throughout history, it normally takes 2 years, in the region of 2 years, for an increase in money supply, so an increase in the printing of money and quantitative easing, to have an impact on inflation. So over the next couple of years, although the crash might come before then, at some stage down the line in the short to medium term, prices are going to go higher and higher and higher, and inflation is going to increase. And don't forget, our interest rates are lower than they've ever been. So this phenomenon that people have been experiencing for the last 10 years, whereby the money that they have sitting in the bank is doing nothing for them, and their cost of living are increasing all the time. This is only going to go further in the two directions. Boom. So that's going to push people more aggressively, in my opinion, towards housing and towards the stock market, which will create this feeling of euphoria. I also think this will tie in with people's, like, economics all comes down to mass psychology. So I think that it'll also tie in with people believing that, look, oh, they've finally, got it this time. Obviously this whole money printing thing works. We had the massive pandemic crash, and this money printing thing saved us. Oh, we're invincible. It'll lead to this feeling of euphoria. Plus, people will be exuberant because they'll be in this post-lockdown world where they're excited and want to spend. And what was the last point I was going to say? Well, basically, I think things are going to go up. Asset prices and stock markets are going to go up, so they're not going to want to miss the boat, and they're just going to put whatever they have into the stock market. And then I believe we will have the big crash. Also, I'll just say that now, because there is this element of uncertainty, and if anyone types in crash or anything now and looks at the normal economist channels all over YouTube, everyone's saying, oh, this is the time to get into gold and silver. And all the guys like Mike Maloney and Jim Rickers and Peter Schiff and all these fellas who've been saying that this crash is coming feel vindicated now. They feel like this is it. They're saying, I told you it was too late, because right now, short term, although gold and silver prices haven't shot up yet, in fact they crashed briefly, the premiums are so high on the physical purchase of gold and silver bullion and coins that it's kind of vindicated them in a certain way, and they believe that, look, this is what I told you would happen. Now, what I actually think is going to happen is I think silver will crash to in and around $10, and I think gold will go down to as far as 1,000, as low as 1,000, sorry. And then I think the next 10-15 years gold will go through the roof and silver will follow. So yeah, personally I think the two plays right now are, one, don't worry about sitting on cash, don't feel like you're missing the boat. I would recommend that in about 12 months, whenever gold gets into the region of about 1200s, if you're in any way, like at the moment it's something like $1,500 for 1 ounce of gold. It's difficult for the average person to be able to put any money in it. At the moment it's about $14 for 1 ounce of silver, so silver's more of a play for the average person. But I would say in about 12 months, when silver goes to about 12, when gold goes to about 1200, I'd start moving into the physical assets. And I do imagine that they will go as low as 1,000 and to as low as 10 for silver. But as Rockefeller used to always say, I always won because I always bought too early and sold too early, or something like that. So if you try and time the bottom, you'll miss it. That's just the practical realities of life. There's too many complex things that happen near a bottom, and you basically won't get it. So if you want to start getting gold and silver, I would recommend starting to ladder in early, as in 6 months, 12 months kind of thing. But at some stage in the next 12 to 24 months, I believe we will have the big crash, but I don't believe this is it. I think we're going to lead into one final bull run now. And I think that the only thing that's going to go up over the next 12 to 18 months will be stock markets. It's the one that everyone in the world right now thinks, all they're saying is recession, how bad is this recession going to get, how low are we going to go? Nobody's putting money into stocks now. Everyone's saying, oh, this is a dead cat bounce. You have to think like the 1%. 99% of people lose, 1% win. So yeah, I'll just finish by mentioning the pension crisis. The baby boomer generation came after the generation who went through World War II and the Great Depression, so they didn't want to live through that same austere living type of lifestyle. So they were an audacious bunch who lived well, spent their money and invested in things, bought houses and went on holidays and things like this. They're the biggest spending generation in history, and they're all retiring en masse right now. So what happens when you retire? You pull in the reins, you stop your spending, and stock markets cannot effectively live with that generation stopping spending and pulling in the reins. Also, depending on the country, most pensions are built into the stock market anyway, so there's going to be a serious crisis if and when there is a crash in terms of what's left for people to be able to take their retirement out of. So it's not a nice position to be in. It's going to be a scary kind of 5, 10, 15 years. And my recommendations are to move whatever you can, as much as you can, to gold and silver over the next 12, 18 months to reduce and eradicate debt wherever possible. If you can get rid of your house now, maybe you might have as much, there might be a situation over the next 6 to 12 months where house prices actually continue to go higher. So if you can get out of any debt like a house and a mortgage that you have now, I would recommend doing it, renting, spending as little as you can, getting cash physically out of banks, because there will inevitably probably be bank runs in the end, and getting as much money into gold and silver as possible. I know that sounds crazy to people who possibly haven't heard this sort of talk before, but yeah, that's my recommendation anyway. Is there anything else that I missed? Probably, but hey, we'll maybe start doing more videos like this. To all those people who have remained subscribers from whenever I was doing like those sports and boxing videos, thank you very much for sticking with us. I always say us, it's just me, like I'm pretending that I've got some sort of team with me. Maybe Rocky and Clubber Lang in the picture behind me, you can see, I'm not sure, or those 4 random horses. But yeah, I'll keep doing videos like this, and this was more of a general overview of everything, but I'll start doing more niche specific videos. Any feedback, positive or negative, I'll always appreciate. If you disagree, that's great. Most do, most will anyway, but the only thing I'm long right now, I'll just say, is VR, virtual reality. Think about it, everyone's working from home and going to have to for quite some time. Actually, the company from Waterford, Ireland, called VR Education, that I mentioned in the video last Sunday, their share price went up this past week by something like 40%. So it's been a good week on the VR front. But yeah, be creative in terms of your investment strategies. Think about where we lie, and again, I'll have to just say it one more time, cash is a position. Do not jump into investments in such uncertain times unless you have serious confidence in what you're doing. But again, I think that you will not go wrong medium to long term if you start moving towards gold and silver now. Although it might fall by as much as 40% in value over the next year, if you hold any gold and silver that you don't need the money right now type thing, I think gold and silver will be worth at least 10 times as much as it is now in like 10 to 15 years. So yep, that's where we're heading. Thanks for your time. If you've watched to the end, you're a legend. Subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers.